It's 4 in the morning, February 1862. You're lying in a field somewhere in Virginia. The temperature is 14 degrees Fahrenheit. You have no tent, you have no sleeping bag, there is no fire, and in 3 hours, you have to wake up, grab your rifle, and march 15 miles. This wasn't a punishment. This wasn't a rare night. This was Tuesday. Welcome. Today, we're going deep into one of the most overlooked survival stories in American history. Not the battles, not the generals, the night. Because here's what nobody tells you. More Civil War soldiers died from disease and exposure than from bullets. Twice. So the battlefield, as horrific as it was actually the safer place to be compared to just surviving the winter. Think about what these men were marching into. Campaigns didn't stop for weather. Roads turned into rivers of mud so deep they swallowed wagon wheels. One soldier in the 155th Pennsylvania Infantry wrote home describing his camp as wild, bleak, and desolate. The elements have been warring for the last fortnight and left a sea of mud. A sea of mud in February with nowhere to sleep. So how do you survive that? What do you actually do when the sun goes down and the temperature drops below freezing and you have no tent? Let's break it down. It starts with a single piece of kit. Most people have never heard of it. It's called a gum blanket. It looks like a tarp. That's basically what it is. A 60 by 70-inch sheet of canvas coated on one side with vulcanized rubber, little brass grommets along the edges. The Union Army issued nearly 2 million of these things during the war, and when you understand what it does, you understand how men stayed alive. Here's the system. You lay the gum blanket flat on the ground, rubber side down. That rubber creates a barrier between your body and the frozen earth because the ground doesn't just freeze you, it pulls heat out of you constantly, all night long. Without that barrier, you're done. Then you lay your wool blanket on top of it. You lie down and you pull everything over yourself. Gum blanket on the outside, wool on the inside. That's it. That's your shelter. But here's the brilliant part. Wool. Modern science has confirmed what these soldiers figured out by necessity. Wool retains 80% of its insulating capability even when completely wet. Cotton? Zero. Cotton kills you when it's wet. This is why Confederate soldiers, who were often issued cotton uniforms, suffered so much more than their Union counterparts on cold, wet nights. One Union reenactor who tested authentic period gear described it this way. He woke up one morning at a December event with 2 inches of snow on top of his gum blanket and wool setup and said he barely felt cold all night because the rubber held the heat in, like a shell, like a cocoon. Soldiers became almost fanatically protective of their gum blankets. Men would throw away their overcoats, their extra ammunition, even food, but they never dropped their gum blanket. In fact, one soldier reportedly scratched a curse on the untreated side of his, directed at whoever might try to steal it. We don't know exactly what it said, but I think we can guess. But the gum blanket alone wasn't always enough. When temperatures really dropped, soldiers had another technique, and it's one of the most human, unexpectedly funny things I've ever read about this war. It was called spooning. In those early big canvas tents, the Sibley tents, designed for 12 men but usually crammed with 20, soldiers would lie on the ground in a tight row, pressed together shoulder to shoulder, like spoons in a drawer. And when one man's hip started aching from the frozen ground, he couldn't just roll over by himself. The whole row was locked together. So he'd call out, loud enough to wake everyone up, "Spoon!" and all 20 men would flip over at the exact same time. I want you to think about that for a second. You're exhausted, your feet hurt, you've been marching for 3 days, it's midnight, it's below freezing, and you just got woken up because some guy's hip hurts, and you still roll over, together, because that shared body heat is keeping you alive. That's not a funny story. That's brotherhood under the worst possible conditions. Now, what about the soldiers who had nothing at all? No gum blanket, no tent, not even a full wool blanket. This was especially common for Confederate troops in the later years of the war, when supply lines had collapsed and entire regiments were marching in rags. These men became remarkably creative. If there were fence rails nearby, and there almost always were in rural Virginia, they'd stack 3 or 4 rails against the fence itself and hang a blanket over the top. Instant lean-to. If there were no rails, they'd pile straw and dry leaves between 2 fallen logs and burrow in. The dead organic matter acts as insulation. It traps air, and trapped air is warmth. One Union soldier wrote from Alabama in October 1864, "Where there's plenty of rail fences, there's no trouble keeping warm." And when winter dragged on long enough that armies stopped moving altogether, usually December through February, they built cabins, actual log cabins, with mud chimneys, plank floors, canvas roofs when they couldn't find timber. The Army of the Potomac's winter camp at Brandy Station in 1863 became so elaborate with organized streets, drainage ditches, and permanent structures that soldiers called it a city. They built a city out of nothing in the middle of a war, because humans will do extraordinary things when the alternative is freezing to death. Now, stay with me here, because I saved the most important part for last. Because all of this, the gum blankets, the spooning, the gopher holes, this was the Union experience. The Confederate experience was something else entirely. By the second winter of the war, the Confederate supply system was in free fall. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, arguably the most celebrated fighting force of the entire conflict, was marching barefoot in December. No rubber blankets. They'd been stealing them off dead Union soldiers just to survive. Their uniforms? Often cotton, which, as we've established, is a death sentence in cold wet. The Confederate government at one point had to put out a public appeal asking civilians to donate blankets, quilts, even carpets. Carpets! They were pulling up carpets from living room floors to send to soldiers dying of cold in the field. A South Carolina relief organization wrote in 1862, "Let the comforts be retained for use at home, and our blankets be sent to our soldiers." Citizens of the Confederacy were giving up warmth in their own homes so that soldiers might survive another winter night, and many still didn't. The mortality from disease and exposure in Confederate camps was catastrophic. Desertion rates spiked every winter, not from cowardice, but from men who'd simply reached the limit of what a human body can endure. So, back to that field. 4 in the morning, February 1862, 14 degrees. You know the answer now. A rubber blanket under you, wool above, 6 men pressed together for heat, feet aimed towards the dying coals of whatever small fire you managed before lights out. That's how you survived. Not with technology, not with training, not with anything we would recognize today as adequate gear. With ingenuity, with community, with the stubborn refusal to die before morning. These men were, by and large, farmers, school teachers, shopkeepers, young men who'd never slept outside a day in their lives before the war, and within a season, they were outsmarting winter with a rubber sheet and a fence rail. I think about that the next time I complain about camping. If you learned something today, if this changed how you think about this war, about these men, about survival, hit that subscribe button. Every week, we go deep on the history that doesn't make it into textbooks, the real stories, the human stories. And if you want to go further down this rabbit hole, I've got a video right here on how Vietnam War soldiers actually navigated their way in the dense jungles without GPS. Spoiler, it's somehow even worse than sleeping on a frozen fence. I'll see you there.